Hello and welcome to this very special one-off video in which I am delighted to be interviewing Christine Lior Locher. Christine is a KLS member, has been for about 18 months now, but she's recently completed her journey to Judaism. She's just become a Jew by choice. She's just converted. We held her admission ceremony just over a week ago at KLS. And she has written for us, if you haven't already seen it, do check it out. She has written for us a wonderful, wonderful essay, which is on our website, talking about her journey over the course of the last 2 years, 20 years, 40 years to Judaism. And I thought, as well as reading about it, I'd love to ask her some more questions. And I thought, why not do that in a video so we can share the conversation with everyone who's interested. So Christine Lior, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Mazel tov again for your incredibly successful entry into the tribe, as we say. Can we just start by just giving us a brief, if that's possible, and general background to who you are, how you came to be here?
Yes. Why? Who am I? Why am I? How am I?
Yeah, why are we talking to you?
Yes. So I'm Christine Lior. I'm 42. I was born in southern Germany, which you can probably still hear from my accent. I lived in Germany for the first 20 plus years or so. I was always interested. So I grew up in a super tiny village. It was so small that we didn't have street names. So the houses were numbered in the order they were built. It was also the type of very traditional rural environment where girls typically wouldn't do A-levels. So most of what I've done since A-level is pretty inconceivable to kind of where and how I grew up. But I always kind of wanted to see how big the world is and what else is out there. And that was, I think, a key motivation for me to obviously do A-levels and then do everything else. I think I was a very dreamy child, probably. So I had this sort of immersion in nature. I mean, mind you, there was really nothing else except nature. So, you know, where else would I have gone? But I always felt this kind of deep unity. And I think, I mean, at like age 8 or 9, I don't think I would have called it spiritual back then, but looking back, I think it definitely had some of that. I was raised Catholic, in case Christine Maria isn't enough of a hint.
It's not a very Jewish name.
No, not quite. And the kind of the family and the surroundings took that very seriously. And there were bits about it that I liked and bits about it that really weren't for me. So basically, by the time I was 18 and able to choose for myself, I kind of unchose that, basically. And then spent about 20 years giving, doing pretty solid research, was what else was out there. So, I mean, I went to India for 6 months, stayed in various ashrams, did meditation retreats, trained as a yoga teacher, read across really most of the big religions. I also tried, and I think that's really interesting, because I think I'm interested in the human soul, if that makes sense. And the way we've kind of organized it in modern Western society is everybody gets a little chunk. So, psychology gets a little bit, and various religions get various bits, which they all structure in different ways. And nobody ever seems to properly talk to each other. And then for the individual, it never quite comes together. And for me, that never really made sense to keep all of that separate. So if you look at my CV, the complete version that's not edited for specific purposes, there's all these elements, and it doesn't really look like they fit together, except for me, they kind of do. So for example, for me, I studied psychology and intercultural studies. I also lived in Japan and Ecuador and had different brushes, again, with different cultures, different ways of being spiritual, and so on. And all of that was really interesting, but it didn't quite fully click for me. So I always felt a bit like a tourist in what I was seeing. And then actually when my first real brush with Judaism, oddly enough, was in Japan. So I lived in Japan for a while studying. I know it's not the most logical place to come across Judaism, but you know, sometimes the world has its ways. Yeah, so one of my classmates was an American Jew who was at that point trying to figure out how observant she wanted to become in her own life. So she was reading all these things and going through this massive process herself. And we just kind of got along really well. So I remember having all these really deep conversations. And I learned so much about that, about Judaism and about that way of seeing the world and of being in the world. And that was just really, really fascinating. And then she decided to become modern Orthodox. So she went sort of pretty far along that spectrum, ended up moving to Israel, where then a couple of years later, and mind you, that was 20 or so years ago, I then visited her. And there were a lot of things I found really fascinating, but it was also really clear for me, okay, Orthodox is definitely not, that's definitely not quite the right setup for me. I do like the world quite a lot, as chaotic and messy as it is, I do have to say. So, but again, you know, that was just a really interesting step on the journey. And then I think my next encounter with Judaism was when I was living in the US. Yes, I did move around a fair bit once I was out of the village.
We'll count them up later.
Yeah, I've been, so I lived in the US for a while in Boston, and just by coincidence, really, everybody in the team I was working in at the time, except for me, was Jewish. So that was just really lovely. I just really enjoyed that. So I became a bit more curious about the holidays, because that was then obviously a theme. And then at some point, I ended up having a housemate who converted as an adult. So she was, well, not quite converted. She was patrilineal, but wasn't raised Jewish. So she still went through the classes and all of that, and then had an adult bat mitzvah at some point. And obviously, given that she was my flatmate, and I just started reading all her books, basically.
Right.
And then she told me, oh, there's an introduction class. Would you like to come along? And obviously I work in learning and development now, so I never say no to a good class. So I went, and I was really fascinated about the combination of intellectual rigor and sort of practical things, but also kind of something deep and old. And I think that combination for me seemed to work pretty well. So I took more and more classes, and I was basically on the path to converting in the US. And then actually my visa ran out, so I had to leave. And then I moved to the UK. Yeah. And then at some point during a couple of years after having moved to the UK, I moved to Kingston. And as you know, of all people,
the rest is history.
The rest is history. Yeah,
we'll definitely come back to that, Christine, Lior. Just kind of like quickly cycling back. I was really interested in what you said about when you were, when you were growing up, you kind of felt spiritual, even though you wouldn't necessarily have called it that. And then obviously you knew that Catholicism was not for you, and you left that behind when you were 18. But did you always feel that you were looking for a religion once you had left Catholicism behind, or was it more generally a way to kind of express the spiritual side, if that makes sense?
Oh, that is a very good question. I don't think I was necessarily looking for like a club membership, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I was initially mainly just trying to figure out who I am in the world and trying to make sense of some of the bigger questions. And so I kind of glossed over my various moves a little bit. Not all of that worked, particularly seamlessly and so on. So, like life just occasionally knocks you over a little bit, and then you need to dust yourself off and get back up again. So I think in the beginning it was mainly individual. I did then also, I guess a bit later in the process, look at, well, how does this show up in the world? So what's the contribution you're making, or what's the way you see humanity, and how are you trying to make things better? Because ultimately, I think for me it has to be the combination of going deep and then also bringing some of that back and doing something that hopefully makes things better with that. I didn't initially look for a community because I hadn't really experienced that as something particularly positive.
Right.
So so that wasn't necessarily on my list. I did, and I think a lot of the big religions have something around, that you're not alone in this, but that there is some sort of a community or congregation. And I think that makes perfect sense. And I think that was only when I got a little bit older that I also realized that it does make sense to be on a path with other people, and that's actually really nice and also really helpful, because you're not alone, and it's more fun. You learn from each other and so on. So
and there's this lovely paragraph, or few paragraphs in your essay, about how finding religion is like falling in love. And
yes,
I just thought it was so beautiful, and it was such a lovely way to put it as well. And you've talked about how it was a sort of the combination of the deep thinking, but also the kind of heritage that sort of attracted you to Judaism as well. I mean, can you say a little bit more about what was it made you fall in love, if you like, with Judaism?
Yes. I think it was the fact that it's something old and deep, not something that somebody just came up with 7 minutes ago.
Yes, it's not a fad.
So,
it's not
exactly.
a passing fad.
You can definitely tell, okay, this is stood the test of time. I like that it's also, obviously, with Jews being fairly distributed around the world, it's not necessarily linked to a specific, local culture or region, or there's lots of different ways you can be Jewish and a part of the tribe, of the family, and that made sense to me. The idea that there's lots of discussion, I like that. So it's not like, here's what I'm telling you, you believe that or else. It's like, okay, here is an idea, let's have a chat about what that means, and you're perfectly welcome to disagree as long as you've thought about it and made that's just part of how things get evolved. And I think the idea that you take something that essentially was written down or thought up in what's pretty much like late Bronze Age, and you then figure out, okay, what does that mean for 2020? Because I mean, human nature hasn't really changed that much. I mean, so and then you figure out, what does that mean for right now? To me, that's a very useful process, and I think that's also something I can get with, because obviously, I mean, I've got degrees. I live in I live in 2020. I've got scientific training and so on. So it's not, and religion is, I think it's a really interesting one, because there's obviously no rational decision-making process, that could get you to, okay, I've weighed up all the options and I've decided to pick a religion.
Yeah.
Like, it's just literally not how it
but
works.
that's where your analogy with falling in love is so good, because you don't kind of like draw up a checklist, do you, and go, right, okay, this person has got the most pros on my checklist, therefore I'm now going to fall in love with him or her. It's just and I thought that was such a good way of describing it.
Yeah, so I think it's really that. I think it's an emotional home. I think it's this, does my life get better with that than without? Which is also why it's good that the conversion process takes a while, because you kind of need to, test drive that a little bit with yourself and everyone else.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because the other thing that I found, I found your whole article fascinating, but I know that you draw the parallels between the change that you were going through yourself, as you were going through that conversion process, but also, you work a lot with change in your professional life. So can you say a little bit about that and the parallels that you found there, between what you were going through personally, but also what you were maybe helping other people going through on a different level in your professional career?
I think it was a really interesting process, because I think at some point, if you do something professionally, of course, you've got all the training and you've got all the empathy, but I mean, let's face it, someone else's change is always easier than your own. And,
Right.
we have all these smart things we say about, when you have to step out of your comfort zone and blah, blah, blah. But someone else, it's always easier for someone else. And I think it was super interesting to experience myself in that process again, to really, okay, that's a really big change. Let's see what that's like, on a day by day, week by week basis over a period of time. And to really see, okay, that, do the sort of things we tell other people, does that actually make sense? And there are a few elements I found quite helpful, like, what are the stories you're telling yourself about yourself? So, obviously I've given you a probably quite wordy, but still, that still wasn't like a play-by-play 42-year-old lasting summary of the 42 years. So there was obviously, massive editing happening. But then what we edit and what we emphasize for ourselves and for others changes. And that's one of the ways sort of change starts taking hold, and you start kind of anchoring things in yourself. So I think my stories and how I show up is a lot more Jewish, which, like 20 years ago, it would not have been, and it couldn't have been, but now it is. And that's great. Also then, the people you spend time with, the ideas you spend time with, I do still continue my learning journey. And, I'm more interested in Jewish related topics than I was before. And I think that's also a part of that. And also this kind of just giving it time. And some of the things, like with rituals, or with, I think I'm just sort of by nature, I'm a fairly reflective person. But for example, the process with the high holy days just makes a lot of sense. But also you have to do it. Like, it doesn't just make sense if you read it in a book and you're like, okay. You have to actually sit down and do it. And I think with a lot of rituals, I mean, they call it, religious practice for a reason, because you have to kind of do it a lot, and it won't always be like right. And also, it's not the Olympics, like, you don't get like extra points for doing extra thing. Like, it doesn't really work like that. And that was just really useful, I think.
And again, in your article, you talk about how when you are going through that period of change, and when you are changing an aspect of your identity, you actually have to live it. You can't think yourself into a new identity. You actually have to live it. And I think, that's to what you're saying about, you have to go through the rituals, you have to experience the Jewish year and all of the, all of the holidays and all of the Shabbats and everything like that. And I can't remember exactly what it says. You have to live your new self out loud, step by step, sometimes before things have fully sunk in. So did you sometimes feel you were doing something, but you were like, well, I'm doing this, but I'm not really sure why, I don't know, and it's like,
yeah, like so I found KLS in spring, and then kind of started the conversation with Rabbi Renee and so on. And then he said, look, basically the next big thing that's coming up is Pesach. Would you like to join the Seder? And obviously I said yes, because you say yes to everything, and that's how you, well, I didn't know that at that time.
Oh, right. So an added bonus.
I didn't even know there was going to be food, but Yeah, so obviously I said yes, but I remember I was sitting there, I didn't really know anybody, and I was kind of looking around, and obviously, the the thing is with the Haggadah, it does guide you through step by step, so you kind of have a manual about how everything's going to come together, but there's lots of steps, and it is a bit confusing if that's like literally your first, okay, and then you're like, okay, so I'm meant to be eating all these things in all that order, okay, so I'll just do that then.
I'll do as I'm told. Yeah.
I mean, but then it kind of, yeah, I think with the rituals, you just kind of need to keep doing them, and then they start doing the thing they're meant to be doing. And it's not like, it's not the small thing. I think it's the big thing, like, for example, during lockdown, I wasn't able to get hold of matzah, so I had gluten-free oat crackers. Yes, I'm sorry, it's really not, but obviously shops are empty and it was all a bit. So, you could argue, was that a proper Seder plate or, setup? And it probably wasn't, because sometimes you need to kind of improvise a little bit. And it still did something.
And then you speak very movingly again in your essay about this year's High Holy Days and the Kol Nidre service in particular.
Yeah, because I think it's one of the things I really like is the personal responsibility. So it's not one of those faiths where you go through the motions and then you just sort of upward delegate, and by magic everything sort of,
yes,
as tempting,
I've been a good girl, God, so
exactly,
yeah, give me what I want.
Exactly, as tempting as that might be, I don't think human beings really work like that. I think you still need to do the work, and it encourages you to do the work, which is good, because sometimes humans need a nudge. It helps to be in it with other people. And I also like the idea that there are second chances. The idea that, it's sort of penciled into the book, but there's still, like you can still kind of, make a few final edits before it gets sealed.
Yeah.
That does make a lot of sense, I think, with how
humans
work.
That's a great story, if you like, as well. I don't mean to be writing your story for you, obviously, but, going from the sort of Pesach, and that would have been back in 2019, to 18, where you, like you say, you were feeling a little bit lost and weren't really quite sure what was happening, and fast forward 18 months. And obviously all of that time you'd been going through the classes and experiencing, the rest of what the community has to offer. And then we get to the High Holy Days and you have obviously a very, very meaningful experience. So there's that real kind of arc there.
So. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think one of the other things that keeps attracting me to Judaism is I think in the conversations I had in Japan with my classmate, I was struck by how much sense that all made from a psychological perspective.
Oh yeah.
So it just kind of felt to make sense with how how I've experienced human nature and what I learned in my psychology degree at that time. Later, obviously, because as part of the conversion process, you have to write essays. And I wrote one essay about Musa. That's a Jewish spiritual practice that works with core values. And this is very sort of a very psychological process. I started realizing as I was doing research for that now, obviously, Freud did have a Jewish background, even though he wasn't sort of practicing on a day-to-day basis, but that was sort of the culture he had grown up with. So it was almost like rediscovering psychology, but kind of backwards, because I realized that a lot of the reasons why Judaism seems to make so much sense from a psychological point of view is because that's where Freud had, lifted and shifted
that's where
quite a
he
few
had kind
things.
of come from.
So I'm like, okay, that's why it makes sense, because that's where he got it from. So that was quite interesting. So I started reading a whole lot more about that in sort of February, March. I spent a lot of time in the British Library doing some very joyful reading and exploration. And obviously, I haven't been able to go back because of lockdown and stuff, but that is something that I definitely want to spend a bit more time. So that was a cool discovery that kind of also brought
fascinating. Yes. And you're
branches
gonna help, you and Rabbi Rene, I believe, are going to be helping the KLS community kind of learn more about Mussar, the practice of Mussar. So, I think bringing obviously Rene's rabbinic wisdom as well as your learning and development side of things should be something really special that you have to offer. So watch your space on that one. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about in your again in your essay you're talking about you're a member of the LGBT community and you're talking about how in some branches of Judaism that would just not be, you wouldn't necessarily be welcome with open arms, but obviously you've joined liberal Judaism and you talk about being non-binary. Can you just explain a little bit more about what that actually means?
Yes. So I mean, typically people would either identify as male and female, and people think that's fairly obvious, although that's possibly up for debate as well. And for a lot of people, they would say, okay, there's those two and that's it. And for a while, I thought that too, because that's how I was raised, but that never quite seemed to make sense for me. I mean, I remember I had my first gender conversation in a Catholic kindergarten in rural southern Germany when I was 5. That conversation did not go well at all.
Gosh.
I was basically told I wasn't, like my movement patterns weren't the one of a girl, and I should basically move differently. And I genuinely just didn't understand what she was trying to tell me. It just didn't make sense because that's not how I felt.
And you were 5?
Exactly. So that was a long time ago, but I still remember the conversation and me kind of desperately trying to explain my point of view. I mean, obviously, again, as a 5-year-old, not really finding the right way of kind of bringing that together. So I kind of ignored that a little bit. Puberty was a bit of a shock because I thought in puberty you turn into who you were meant to be. And I turned into somebody with a female body, which didn't quite feel like what I had ordered, really. And then I kind of brushed that aside a little bit. And then when I was living in the US, at some point, my company instituted a policy that they were going to pay for transition surgery. So I got curious about what that actually means and looked up all the details and, what that means and the process and just kind of the practicalities of that all. And then I kind of realized, what, that actually doesn't really make sense either, because then I would be on the other side of the fence, but that's probably not where I'm meant to be either. Maybe there's just a space in between. And then I went to the theater in New York, and they sent me a user satisfaction survey, and it had a drop-down box for gender that had 10 different things in it. And I remember looking at that, I was like, I don't even know what all of that is. So I spent a massively confusing evening Googling what all these things meant and just kind of letting it all sink in to immediately land. So what that means for me is basically, it's kind of a mix of both and neither. So it's genuinely the space in between that has, something of one side and something on the other side. And that can vary. So, you see me wearing nail polish, accidentally, actually a rainbow themed one.
Very nice. And it looks like it's coordinated with the top there as well. So very cool.
Yes. So, so I think it varies a little bit how I feel on any given day. I think I'm always in the space in between, but that space is obviously fairly big because it's a spectrum, and I'm sort of sometimes gravitating a bit over there and sometimes a bit over here. And it just felt extremely liberating, not having to pick a side. So I remember, for example, most times when you do anything official, like, checking in for a flight, if we remember, way back when.
In the good old days.
What I was like, and you need to like tick the box. I always felt this emotional, like, because it just never quite felt right. Yeah, so that's kind of what it means. It's really the space in between, and just
that makes so much sense, and that's really clear. And like you say, it's like you don't have to be one or the other. you know. And again, I keep referring back to your essay because it's so wonderful. Explain what that means. In fact, explain a little bit anyway about, you know, when you do convert to Judaism and you take on a Jewish name, and you know what the traditional thing would be, and what you decided to do with your non-binary identity in mind. This is just great.
Yeah, so basically, so if when you become Jewish and you don't have a Jewish name, then you get one, basically. And there are lots of different ways to find a name. It could either be a name that's in the scriptures, so one of the characters, or it could be a modern Israeli name that are very often, you know, Hebrew words for nice qualities and so on. And quite a lot of these are of the modern Israeli Hebrew names are actually gender neutral. So I thought, well, that's amazing. Then I don't need to pick sides. So that's actually brilliant. So I picked Lior as a name, which means my light. And I thought, you know, more light in the world is definitely a good idea. So that kind of works. It's also reasonably pronounceable, which was another key filter that, you know, it works in most languages and cultures. And then what happens if your parents aren't Jewish? You get, basically, it defaults back to Abraham and Sarah as the first Jewish parents. So normally you would either become your Hebrew name Ben, son of Abraham and Sarah, or your Hebrew name Bat, daughter of Abraham and Sarah. Now that's obviously, again, there's only two options, and some of it is just how Hebrew grammar works, just because there's like two and nothing else. And a lot of languages are like that. So as I had my Beit Din, I basically said, look, is there any way, given that my first name is in between, is there any way we can find some way of making an in between? And the compromise they suggested, which I think is brilliant, is I'm now Lior Beit Avraham Vesara. So that means from the house of. First of all, I think this sounds super fancy. So I'm like, yes.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
It's just really great. And also from the house of could literally be anything in terms of gender. So I thought that's just a fabulous way of making that happen. So everybody who's,
and even the word, it's almost like a combination of Ben and Bat, isn't it, as well? I mean, it's bait. It's just absolutely brilliant. Yeah,
and it just kind of like rolls off the tongue. So it's also not like when, you know, when you're called to the bima in the service, it's not something where everybody will like, what was that? You know, it just kind of flows. And I think it's great. I think it's kind of how it should be, you know, like it should be what it is, but it should not be, you know, like I'm not running around with a rainbow feather boa at all times, you know, like that's,
no, that's a shame.
You know, well,
sometimes.
let's see what happens at the end of lockdown. Like, no guarantee, but,
we should all be running around with rainbow feather boas, I think. That's absolutely brilliant. I just love that part of the story. Just if there's anybody watching right now who are either thinking about going through this process, are going through the process of converting to Judaism, can you just you know, give them a little bit of an idea about what it would involve if they were starting kind of from, you know, scratch, more or less?
Yes. So I think, well, my first recommendation would be don't rush it. You know, like you're going to be Jewish for the rest of your life. So there's no, like, again, there's no prize for being first or anything. Because I remember, so I did most of the process in the US as it was for people converting in the US, which is a lot shorter and less involved than in the UK. So I was kind of hoping I'd be able to like fast track, you know, when I'm like, obviously, yeah, I do work in a business environment. I'm like, oh, does that convert into anything? No, it doesn't. But I mean, so I think it's all those steps are there for a reason. I think it does make sense. So basically, normally it takes a year in the UK, and part of it is because you want to do the full cycle of the year for the holidays. And I do think you have to experience the holidays. Again, it's not really something you can learn. I mean, you're obviously learning it from a book, but you also need to
live
do it. There is a lot of things to learn if you take it seriously. It's also not like, you won't be like done learning within a year either. So that's just to kind of give you enough of a sense. There is Hebrew, obviously, to learn, at least to read and some of the basics. And then it depends a little bit how much people like studying languages and how experienced people are in studying languages that have different writing systems. Some of the people, like, I'm a bit of a writing system geek, so I'm like, yeah, my new alphabet. No, but I realize that's a bit of a niche interest, so that probably won't be everyone's reaction. But I think it's important, and I actually really loved, and mind you, I'm very at the beginning of that journey still, but to be able to understand things at a deeper level, because I find, like in most of what we discuss, everything, like depending on how educated you are, but everything tends to get funneled through Latin. And that has its own, like if you're discussing philosophical concepts or, like the Musa study, for example, it does make sense to go back to the Hebrew word and to be able to unpick what that means, rather than unpicking your idea of what the Latin derived word means in English, because then you
it's like you're going back to the
exactly. So I think it makes sense. I think it can be fun. Again, in the class you're not alone, so there's lots of other awesome people who bring their ideas, and no, I think it's great. You write 2 essays, which again also I think makes sense. One is your personal story, so essentially why I wish to become Jewish. Discuss, right? And that's key, because that's just a good reflection tool for yourself. And I would definitely recommend that people keep good notes throughout the process, because you won't remember in January what that thing was in August and how that was different unless you write it down. And then the second essay is about a Jewish topic of your choice. I think that's great, because then you just pick something that resonates and you start digging a little bit deeper. And that's fun and interesting. And there's not really any rules how, mine turned out fairly academic, because I'm also writing a book, like a secular book about a similar topic. So the list of footnotes might have been about as long as the actual paper. But, like, you don't have to do that. Like, that's my way of approaching things, but there's lots of ways of approaching
more personal
things.
to you.
Yeah. And then you have the Beit Din, which is essentially the like a religious rabbinical court. So it's 3 senior rabbis from liberal Judaism, and they're basically examining you. But it's not like examining, how shall I say that? It's not like a university, not like your final oral exam in that sense. It's more like they want to get to know you and your journey and understand things a bit better. And also, I think, mind you, you might have to ask them, but I think something is also just how they see you react to things, and if that makes sense. So, for example, one of the questions I got asked was, given that I tend to be a bit of a rebel, which might or might not have come through when I went through my biography, but I don't necessarily just go by, okay, this is, the rules for you and so on, so go stick with it. So I got asked quite rightfully, okay, so how do you, with that rebellious streak, how do you see yourself fitting into a community? Which I think is a great question. So, we had a good, honest conversation about that. And I thought that was great. Like, I didn't feel like that was sort of, about being contrarian or about putting me on the spot. It was really about trying to get to know me as a person in where I am and where I would like to go next with this. And that all made sense. So, and mine was via Zoom, which is obviously not like how you would have done it previously. But I have to say, it was still, it was still just really lovely and considerate, and they, made it an experience and made it a step, and that was really good.
So amazing. And link in there from the question about community. Can we sort of just to sort of wrap it up? Can you tell us a little bit about when you came back from the US and you started the journey, but obviously that was then put on hold, and then you found KLS to continue and conclude the journey. Can you tell us a little bit about how you found us, and why were we the right place for you?
Yes, so I started feeling this kind of pull again towards exploring, towards really taking that Jewish journey further, basically, to either pick up the process again or to see where, you know, where I was with that. Because obviously in the US I was in a very specific context and it made sense there. And then in the UK, I wasn't quite sure if it was going to make sense or not. But I thought, look, it still feels like an open thing. So I just need to see what that wants to be. And then I had just moved to Kingston for work. And as you know, I basically live on Twitter. It's pretty much plugged into my brainstem. And I found Kingston Liberal Synagogue. So I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Let's see what that's all about. And I was on the website and that seemed interesting. And then I scheduled a conversation with Renee. And that was also really nice. And then I felt like I just got like roped into things. and that was nice. And I think what I like is I wanted, it's really hard to say. Again, it's a bit the falling in love bit again, you know, like you can't really, you know, like, I mean, I didn't have, you know, a decision matrix or, you know, like criteria or anything. I wanted it to be LGBT friendly, which it obviously is. I wanted it to be sort of international, or at least with a cosmopolitan outlook, that it wouldn't be completely weird for someone like me to be there. I was hoping for, you know, amazing discussions and learning and, you know, broad sprawling conversations, which I'm clearly getting. So that was something, just because that's something I really enjoy. And I did want the kind of, I think the best way of putting is I wanted the depth, but I wanted it to be lightly held. You know, I didn't feel like I needed to, you know, speak with like a hushy spiritual voice when I'm, you know, like I just wanted it to be normal and really extraordinary at the same time. If that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. That does make a lot of sense. Yeah. Because we have that, don't we? I mean, you know, we have a lot of fun and a lot of laughs, but you like, we do have, you know, the deep conversations as well.
Yeah. And I think for me, it's also about a community, because I find, you know, like in my work and so on, you know, there's like a community of practice or professionals doing similar things, but it's all like, you know, everybody has sort of a similar-ish background. And I think in a community like that, you have people of all ages. You have people of different educational backgrounds, different political leanings, and so on. And I think that's wonderful. And I think society honestly probably doesn't have enough of those spaces. You know, everyone's just in their tiny little filter bubble, and nothing ever goes across. And I think those spaces are really important. And I'm just really glad that it's, you know, that doesn't mean I don't agree with everything on, you know, with everybody on everything, and you don't have to, you know.
No,
but
well, we don't.
Still, exactly, but you can still recognize everybody's ultimately, you know, a reasonably good person doing their best, and you're kind of in this together, and you share the joys and the pains, and have good food in between.
I was just, you beat me to it there. I was just about to say, and we eat good food, or we did, and we will again, which is a great place to wrap up, isn't it, to think about food. Well, I know, I mean, I know I can speak for myself, and I'm sure the rest of the community won't mind me speaking for them when I say we're delighted that you did find us and delighted that you chose us to complete your journey. Yeah, no, it's just absolutely brilliant. And thank you so much as well for taking the time today to talk about all of that. It's been really, really interesting. And for those watching, if you haven't already, do go to the do go to our website. If you go to the latest news section, you will see Christine Lior's essay. It's really, really worth reading. It's absolutely beautiful. Yeah, thank you again. Thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure. My
Okay.
pleasure.
All right. And thank you for watching.
Sounds good.